I think the work that is being done by AAKP is so critical to patients all around the country. Their ability to advocate on our behalf ensures that everybody understands the impact of kidney disease and what they can do to help us.
Now everybody is fully understanding that to achieve a better quality of life, you really need to listen and take into consideration what the patient views as a better quality of life for them.
I always have fun at an AAKP event. How could you not have fun? You're with people who understand completely what you and your family are going through. So it's not just for patients, AAKP. AAKP should be for the family of patients, because when a patient has kidney disease, the family has kidney disease.
Belonging to an independent advocacy organization like AAKP gives me the confidence that I can represent them and people living with kidney disease to represent them honestly.
Our objective over the coming decade is to reach people around the globe and not just limited to the United States, because kidney disease is a universal disease.
They encourage patients to be the voice for their care and treatment. And I don't see that as much in other organizations. And I feel like that is so necessary for patients to feel like they have a voice and they can make change in regards to their care and treatment.
I think the AAKP, by being a patient-oriented group, impacts not only the medical devices, but pharmaceuticals and pretty much anything that's to do with the patients, because those companies will respond more to a patient than they will to a doctor, I think.
It's important to be a patient advocate because to whom much is given, much is required. I was given this gift of life back in 2008 by my donor, Leanne, rest in peace. She was a deceased donor. So now if I can use my voice and use my platform and influence to impact lives, and my favorite word, why not? And why not become an organ and tissue donor today?
We spend a lot of time here, particularly in DC, in the nation's capital, talking with staff, with the legislators, and trying to help them understand exactly what the patient perspective is on anything that's kidney or renal related. It's a great honor to be able to do it. Our numbers are growing, and part of our strategy is for them to understand that we will come and visit and talk with them, and we represent the patient voice, and we want that to be heard, and that's how we do it.
People around the world who are sick and suffering with kidney disease need a voice of optimism, they need the tactics, and they need the reinforcement from fellow patients here in the U.S. to do what they do and demand a change in the status quo. And we fully intend to arm patients around the world with the tools they need to be more vocal with their governments, regardless of the ideology of their government, and to demand solutions and to defend private sector companies and investors who are willing to get into this space and deliver more innovation for patients.
AAKP opens the door so that it broadens the whole horizon. You're one person. When you belong to AAKP, you suddenly become a tribe.
Welcome to today's Healthline webinar, the latest in our COVID-19 series, Clinical Trials, Expanding Opportunities for All Kidney Patients in the Midst of COVID-19 and Beyond. AAKP is the nation's largest independent kidney patient organization, and we are vigorous advocates for the right of consumers to choose the therapies that align best to their personal aspirations and life goals, including kidney transplants and home dialysis. AAKP's Healthline webinar program falls under our Center for Patient Research and Education. We believe patient and caregiver education is an integral part of treatment and protection of patient lives, and we work to ensure that patients remain at the center of all kidney research and policy that impacts their lives. This includes federal policies and private sector innovations that impact healthcare services, assistance programs, and access to new products and services. This is especially true during national emergencies such as the coronavirus pandemic, because kidney patients are considered among the most vulnerable populations. At this time, I'd like to introduce AAKP President Richard Knight. Richard is a former in-center hemodialysis patient who received his kidney transplant over 14 years ago. Richard, I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you, Erin. First, I would like to thank everyone who has shown a concern for kidney patients and the threat of COVID-19, and certainly those of you who have joined us on this call today. I'd like to take a few minutes and put today's session into context. We at AAKP, we recognize the disproportionate impact kidney disease has on individuals in the Black and Brown communities across the country. Our fundamental purpose for advocating on behalf of and representing the interests of kidney patients has improved treatments for those who suffer, but tremendous work remains to be done. First slide, please. I'd like to start by framing the crisis. First, we'll take a look at it at the state level. And you'll see here the top 10 states. This information is as of April, but it's certainly still pretty much similar to as it was back then. And I'll talk about my great state of Maryland, which I live in. The red represents the percentage of COVID cases African Americans represent.
Slides
gray,
up.
The
Okay,
gray
great.
represents the percentage of the population African Americans are. So you can see for the state of Maryland, we represent 47% of the cases and 31% of the population. Again, a very, very wide disparity. And starting from Mississippi all the way down to Arkansas, we have what we call a similar disparity point gap. Next slide, please. Let's bring it a little bit closer to home and look at it from a county level. And if you focus on the red, I've summarized the key points here. Compared to majority white counties, counties that are majority Black have 3 times the rate of infections and almost 6 times the rate of death. I happen to live in Prince George's County, and Prince George's County has 27% of the cases for the state of Maryland. There are 24 counties. Next slide, please. We often reference social distancing, and that will serve as a means to help keep us safe. If we focus on the items that are in orange here, we can see that African Americans represent 12% of the entire American workforce. 25% of all food and courier delivery workers, 27% of postal workers, and 31% of all public and urban transport workers. So we're talking about folks that are delivering the mail, work in the food industries, your bus drivers, your taxi cab drivers. A little bit difficult to social distance there. And now that you've seen the impact of COVID-19, you can understand why so many of us in the advocacy community have been frustrated by the lack of clinical trials for COVID-19 therapeutics. What's even more frustrating is you consider that kidney patients were not included in some of the first trials. Given the massive risk for and the reality of kidney disease within the Black and Brown communities, we find this to be very, very problematic. Next slide, please. One of the things that we propose and we believe, and as an organization, we advocate, educate, and promote patient engagement. And as we look at patient engagement, being the involvement of patients, from the planning the study to conducting the studies to disseminating study results, what we're talking about is patients being involved in the process. So what we like to say is that there's no great mystery to increasing minority involvement through patient engagement. I'm a business person. I teach courses in strategy, and a fundamental rule is that devise your product for the audience most likely to need it and benefit from it. So in conclusion, with respect to patient engagement, effective patient engagement means involving the patients most in need or at risk. And we believe that patient engagement done right will get you minority patients to enroll in clinical trials. Next slide, please. But let's take a look at a best practices. And in this case, we're going to talk about a government agency that is doing so. Patient engagement at NIDDK, National Institute for Diabetes, Digestive and Kidney Diseases, the KUH division, Kidney Urology Hematology Studies. They started a project that was funded back in 2017. At the beginning, before the project got off ground, they organized a community engagement work group. That community engagement work group was comprised of patients and some clinicians. I have the honor of being the co-chair of that community engagement work group, and my colleague, Dr. Kathy Tuttle, who is a tremendous researcher in her own right, but she's also a patient. We co-chair that together, and our job is to make certain that the patients are involved in the process. Well, what do the patients do? Well, the patients drafted the informed consent document. The patients champion a unique no-fault insurance setup. The patients are involved in all steering committee meetings. Patients are involved in protocol development. And also, many times the question is, well, what happens with the results? The patients were involved in the decisions with respect to the results that were going to be returned. And I want to say this. This is not easy. It takes commitment from leadership. And one point that I simply must make, because there tends to be an elephant in the room when we talk about subjects such as this, and we all are aware of the devastating memory of Tuskegee experiments. And we need to understand that in history and culture of the Black community, there remains a certain amount of distrust, significant distrust, if you will, of the medical community, including drug companies. To overcome this, you must work with organizations trusted within the community. That includes patient advocacy organizations with a long history of fighting for a transparent patient care choice. Organizations active within the Black and brown communities are going to be considered trusted, and they will simply have more access to potential clinical trials enrollees. So again, I want to emphasize that you should work with us when you need advice on trials and patients to enroll. That concludes my remarks, folks. I will now ask my fellow transplant recipient and AAKP Chair of Policy and Global Affairs, Paul Conway, to talk about some survey results and make a few other observations. Paul?
Thank you very much, Richard. And I appreciate everybody who's on the call today. AAKP has a long history of participation and in promoting patient engagement, but especially patient enrollment in clinical trials. And we're very pleased to have two very serious and substantive experts in that field and in the field of research with us today. One of the centers that AAKP has is the Center for Patient Research and Education. And in that center of ours, we have multiple capacities to gather insights from patients about different issues that are of importance to the larger medical community and to patients themselves. This particular issue of COVID-19 and participation in clinical trials, not just for coronavirus, but other trials, has been the subject of intense interest over the past 3 or 4 months. First slide, Aaron. We rolled out this week one of our first pretty extensive flash surveys on this particular issue. And we went out and asked patients how they viewed progress on clinical trials in COVID-19. And we raised several different issues. The full extent of this survey will be available by early next week. But these are some of the initial insights. We asked the question, as Richard just mentioned, about the absence of kidney patients in coronavirus clinical trials. And the vast meaning of patient response to that is very negative. Patients expect that if you're going to have something to do with me, you must include me, and that includes treatments for COVID-19. The second question that we asked is on the larger issue of disparities in clinical trials and whether or not, in the absence of aggressive efforts, should companies be doing more to reach out despite the difficulties they often have with recruitment. And the vast meaning of the answers on that is absolutely. Next slide. Getting into more of the details, we wanted to know how many patients of all modalities had been asked to participate in clinical trial research. In tracking with data from last year, this is roughly similar. 30% had been asked, but 70%, overwhelmingly the majority, had not been asked. And so in digging into that data deeper, we asked what are the top 5 concerns that patients have before they would consider participation in trials. And you'll see these right here. Patients want to know the purpose of it. They want to know how long it will be, the logistical concerns of it, what happens if there's an injury, how the treatment will be given to them, and whether or not they have to pay for any part. There are longer answers to this and more detailed questions on insurance coverage and making a patient whole in terms of zero cost. But these are some of the top concerns that they raise. And then we asked patients how they felt about their experience and whether or not they thought that their insights could be helpful. And clearly you see overwhelming response of yes. There's a benign interest and idealism, we believe, among kidney patients to want to try to help those who also suffer. And that has been consistent in our polling over the past 4 or 5 years, but it has become increasingly so over the past 3 or 4. Next slide. So these are some of the capacities that the American Association of Kidney Patients has and has really refined over the past 4 or 5 years in terms of the ability to help academic researchers, pharmaceutical researchers, and those who are involved in the development of clinical trials for diagnostics, devices, and biologics. If you look at the left-hand side, it's the series of tools and capacities that we have running from design to patient consent documents to the actual demographic and geo-targeting that's necessary for particular recruitments or to bring balance to patient participation. On the right-hand side, you see different avenues that we have and different vehicles we have to educate patients. But as this full survey comes out and the results are present, I think that what you'll see is a picture that patients have an idealism. They do want to participate. They're motivated by the idea of being able to help others. They have trust in both government and in the private sector, but they have very specific concerns that they want answered. But in order to reach those patients and in order to engage them, it must be done effectively. It can't be done as simply a check off the box exercise. There has to be substance and seriousness brought to it. And as we turn now to listen to our experts, they'll talk about their reflections on that as folks who have been involved in the field and who have worked directly with patients to make certain that key patient insights are involved in clinical trials from the start to the finish, including the discussion of results and what the impact has been. Thank you. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you so much, Paul. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Greka is Associate Professor of Harvard Medical School and an Associate Physician in the Renal Division in the Department of Medicine at Brigham and Women's Hospital. She is Founding Director of Kidney Next at Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard Medical School. Dr. Greka is also an Institute member and director of the Broad Kidney Disease Initiative at the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard. Dr. Greka, thank you so much for joining us today. Please let me know when you're ready for me to advance your slides.
Thank you. Can you all hear me well?
Yes, thank you.
Excellent. Well, it's a tremendous pleasure and honor to be with all of you today. I can see, at least on the right-hand side of my screen, that we have at least 77 people logged in, and that's just wonderful to have the opportunity to be with you this afternoon. You can advance to the next slide, please. I wanted to speak with you today about two diseases of the kidney that are at the moment considered quite rare, although I will say that and you will see this at the end of my slides, that I think that they are underdiagnosed, and therefore we may be actually able to find more patients as we raise patient awareness. And the reason that I wanted to talk to you about these two rare kidney diseases is because after many years search, we think that we actually have discovered a possible treatment for these diseases, and we are trying to advance the work from the laboratory to clinical trials. And I think this is exactly the perfect moment to bring more awareness to the patient community and try to educate our patients as our partners in this process of going to the clinic. So I wanted to speak today about two kidney diseases. One is called MUC1 or mucin 1 kidney disease. For short, we call it MKD. And the other one is called UMOD or uromodulin kidney disease, for short UKD. These are diseases that run in families in every generation. That means that it's an autosomal dominant disease, as we call it. Basically, the grandparents, the parents, the kids, the grandkids, you know, everybody, someone in the family is going to have the disease. It's a 50-50 chance that the children of a parent with this disease will get the disease from them. Despite the fact that it runs in families, though, it is a relatively silent disease. And what I mean by that is, and I think many of you who have experienced this will probably attest to this as well, you know, progressive kidney disease is quiet. You know, it's not like you hurt over your kidney like you would hurt over your heart if you were having a heart problem. And so therefore, a lot of folks don't even know that this is happening until there's significant kidney damage. And so this is very much a feature of this disease. There's nothing else as a telltale sign. There's no foam in the urine, bubbles in the urine, like we get for some of our other kidney patients who have protein spilling in the urine. There's no blood in the urine like we get in some of the other kidney diseases. This really is a very kind of silent progressive kidney disease caused by this genetic mutation. So our research has shown that these two rare diseases are similar, and they are caused by the accumulation of a mutant toxic protein in kidney cells. And so therefore we have been eager to pursue a treatment that will probably work for both of these diseases in an effort to help as many patients as possible. If you could switch to the next slide, please. Of course, the work that we do in the laboratory, and we use mice, of course, for a lot of the work that we do, requires basically what I call it takes a village. There are a lot of very talented and dedicated young scientists like Moran Vella, who you see in this picture. So Moran decided that she wanted to understand how this disease affects patients. And so what you see at the top is, on the top right-hand side is the kidney of a patient who has this disease, the MKD version of this disease. And then Moran made a mouse in which she put the same mutant gene that causes the disease in patients. She put that in the mouse, and as you can see, the mouse develops the same kind of holes, if you will, in the kidney that we also see in patients. Obviously, this is not a good sign. You want a kidney that looks more like the kidneys to the left under the normal conditions. And so Moran was able to essentially develop a mouse model in which we could now do some experiments so we can try to find a treatment for this disease. So in the next slide. When we look for the toxic protein that accumulates in these mouse kidneys, you can see it in green here. This is a slice of a mouse kidney. And as you can see, there's a lot of the green toxic protein that accumulates exactly where the problem is, where the holes are in the kidney. And so again, this told us that we must be on the right track. We have this toxic protein that accumulates and causes damage. Next slide, please. When we looked at the cells, these are now the components, the cells that comprise the kidney. And we asked the question, what goes wrong inside those cells? When we look under the microscope, what you can see is that the mutant toxic protein, it's in green, as you can see again here on the left-hand side. It accumulates inside the cells in this kind of greenish, bubbles, if you will, that you see there. So again, when we look into cells, and these are human kidney cells that we grow in the laboratory in the dish, we can see that the problem is with this accumulation of this mutant toxic protein. And when we look at the other protein, the UMOD protein that I mentioned, so there are two of them. I mentioned two diseases, two different versions. It's exactly the same thing. Again, in green, you can see that there's a lot of that protein accumulating on the right-hand side of the screen. Okay, so we started to understand what's happening in the mice and what's happening in the cells. And so next slide. What we were basically concluding was people in their DNA, as you can see the DNA on the right-hand side, have a mutation. That means a misspelling in the DNA that tells us the genes in each of our cells in our bodies. That mutant gene, that misspelling in the DNA, causes a toxic protein that accumulates inside kidney cells. Next slide. And what happens when the toxic protein accumulates is that the cells ultimately die. So now you have kidney cells that die. That's why you have holes in the kidney. Next slide. And that ultimately leads to the kidney failure that we saw, both in the human kidney from a patient with the disease, from a patient's biopsy, as well as in the mouse that we studied. So we had now put together the whole picture. We understood what is wrong. And so we wanted to use this understanding to try to find a treatment. So in the next slide, this was really hard work. Basically, one slide summarizes many, many years of hard work by a lot of people in the lab. But I'm showing you two of the heroes, Moran and Masha. They worked together and they naturally wanted a drug that would take away the toxic protein, the toxic green bubbles that I show you to the left. And what was amazing is that after screening thousands of drugs on these kidney cells and looking at thousands of pictures of these kidney cells, they finally found the drug that actually, as you can see on the right, removes the toxic protein. This was a major insight. This was a very happy day in the lab. It doesn't happen very often, but it's a big victory when we can discover something that, at least in these cells, was looked very, very promising. Next slide. We also wanted to see whether this drug works for the other toxic protein that I mentioned, the UMOD. And as you can see, it was doing a pretty good job of clearing out a lot of the green stuff from those cells as well. That's also shown on the right. So now we had an understanding that this drug seems promising. In the next slide. We basically wanted to see, okay, this drug seems to work in cells in the petri dish, but can it actually work in a mouse, right? Before we can go to any clinical trial, we have to be able to show that it works in a living creature. And so we took the mice. In the far left is a mouse that has a ton of the toxic green protein, as you can appreciate. In the middle is a sibling of this first mouse that received the drug for a week. And as you can see, there was a lot of green toxic protein that was removed from that mouse. And the mouse to the right is a sibling of these two other mice that doesn't have the genetic mutation, doesn't have the toxic protein. And so what you can appreciate is that treatment with the drug for a week made the mouse in the middle look much more similar to the mouse on the right than the mouse on the left. And so we were extremely pleased that our drug seemed to actually work in this mouse model. Next slide, please. But mice are not humans. And of course, we cannot take an experimental drug and do a clinical trial before we gain more confidence that it might work in a human system. But recent technology has actually allowed us to do something pretty amazing. We can make little mini kidneys in a dish. We call them organoids. And the hero of this story is Mahesh Amani, another scientist in the lab. And Mahesh is able to create these organoids, which, as you will see in the next slide, they're not a real kidney, because if you can look at a dime, as I'm showing you there, the real size of a kidney organoid, this mini human kidney in a dish, is actually a very small mini kidney. So we still have to use a microscope in order to see all the cells. But the one thing that we have going for us is that this mini kidney has all the different cell types that a human kidney has. So now we can test our drug in a small mini human kidney in the dish rather than in a mouse. And if our drug were to work here, we would again gain more confidence that we must be on the right track. And so in the next slide, we were incredibly blessed and lucky to have 3 patients with the disease who agreed to give us some of their blood. We can take cells from their blood and then turn them into mini kidneys in a dish. So all they had to do is just give us a small vial of blood and their permission, of course. And with their permission, we were able to create these mini kidneys in a dish for these 3 patients. As you can see, they have a lot of that green toxic protein in all 3 cases. So that meant that we had a good system in which we could test our drug. In the far left, you can see under normal. Normal is the brother of one of these patients who does not have the mutation, does not have the kidney disease. And they were also gracious to share some of their blood so that we could create what we call a control, something to compare our patient mini kidneys to. And so, of course, reassuringly, that patient does not have any green toxic protein in their kidney. When we gave all of these mini kidneys in the dish, when we gave them the drug, as you can appreciate, the green mutant protein went away. This was after 3 days of treatment with this drug in these mini kidneys in a dish. These are now human tissues that we are able to test. Again, this result was amazing because it gave us the confidence that we must be on the right track, that we have every reason to believe that we can bring this drug forward into clinical trials and that it will work in our patients. So next slide. Of course, just as we needed patients to do this research in the laboratory, and actually there are patients, some of you may be in the audience, we have had patients visit us in the lab, not only because they were gracious enough to give us samples, but because they wanted to see where the work is happening. And we are very pleased to partner with patients and show them every step of the research that we do. But more importantly, as we head toward clinical trials, we actually needed to partner with patients. This is a rare kidney disease. It requires a genetic test in order to be diagnosed. So we needed to create what we call a registry for these patients. And because, of course, we have several patients in the United States, but this is a worldwide disease all over the world, we actually also created partnerships with colleagues all over the world. So as you can see on the left-hand corner, we have extremely valuable collaborators at Wake Forest, Dr. Tony Blyer and his team, but we have also collaborators in Prague, in the Czech Republic, and we also have collaborators on the island of Cyprus, where there's actually a lot of patients with this disease. And so we basically have been reaching out to colleagues. At this point, I can say that our registry has about 1,800 patients who have these kinds of kidney disease. And we have been able to reach the colleagues in Australia and in all parts of the world, all over Europe, to try to identify more and more patients to put into our registry. And I think, you know, as time goes on, we're trying to spread the word, which is a little bit of what I'm trying to do here today as well, to have more and more patients interested. If they have a family history that fits this pattern, they can go and speak to their doctor and then see if they could get genetic testing to become a part of our registry so that ultimately they could become part of our clinical trials and help bring a solution and a treatment for their kidney diseases. And so it's been just a tremendous response. And as you can see, I became involved in this project in 2015 when we started this registry. And, you know, at the time we had just a handful of patients, and to have almost 2,000 patients in a short 5 years is just an incredible testament to our patients and how wonderful they have been in partnering with us and with all the other clinicians on our teams all over the world. And of course, I would like it to be not too long into the future where we actually have a treatment to offer our patients. But I just wanted to say that the most critical ingredient for our future success is this partnership with patients. And the next slide, please. And so what I wanted to kind of end with is the idea that the registry, we believe, is only the tip of the iceberg. I think that we only know a small subset of the patients who are out there. We think that there are many more. And so my plea and my request to all of you today is to think about this, think about whether you know someone who may be a candidate for testing for this disease. Spread the word. At the Broad Institute, we offer free testing for all, truly free at no cost. Your insurance doesn't ever have to know about this test. And this is just something that can help us in our research and in our quest, of course, to build a treatment for these diseases. And we have some collaborators at Columbia University in New York, and they did a very elegant study where they actually showed that for the UKD patients, we really truly are scratching just the tip of the iceberg. And there's probably many, many more patients throughout the United States and throughout the world who we can try to reach and help ultimately. And so next slide. I just wanted to end with this idea that we have a project in Boston, a collaboration between Mass General, Brigham and Women's, the Broad Institute. We call it the Rare Genomes Project. It's a project that is basically a complete partnership between investigators like myself and patients. It's a website which you can look up. It is not only for kidney disease, but my group is in charge of the kidney part of it. It's focused on all rare diseases for any patient out there who is undiagnosed, who doesn't have a known reason for why they might have a disease that runs in their family, for example, but no one was ever able to find out. And we do sequencing. Again, this is free to the patient. And all that you really need in order to participate in this project is internet and a mailbox. Because essentially, we basically would enroll you over the internet and over the phone. Of course, this requires informed consent. So once all of that is obtained and the patients are willing to participate, then we can mail you a kit where you can give us either saliva or blood from which we can get DNA for sequencing. All questions are answered prior to that, and patients have to feel comfortable with participating in the study, of course, and having their DNA sequenced, give us informed consent. But then we're able to really try to decipher previously unknown causes for rare diseases, including kidney diseases. And so I, again, wanted to make this audience aware of this, again, free to the patients. All you need is internet and a mailbox, and to, of course, agree to informed consent to be eligible for the study. But we have staff who stand by to help patients. At the moment, this is only for the United States, and one day we hope that it could be open to people outside of the United States as well. And in the next slide, I just want to show you a map of all, and this might be a few months old now, but all study participants who have so far raised their hand and said, yes, count me in, I'd like to participate in this study. And the two heroes of this work for the kidney are Catherine Blakesley and Jamie Marshall. And we continue to try to recruit patients and do sequencing. The sign up for this is the quick part, the sequencing is the slower part, but we always promise to be in touch with patients. Patients are in touch with us. You can explore the website and see how we try to keep people abreast of developments. It's a wonderful way to empower patients to become part of the solution, and that's why I'm so proud to be a part of this project, which again is not unique to kidney, but actually tries to reach out to all Americans, anyone who wishes to participate and have a rare disease diagnosed through sequencing. So in the next slide, I just want to show you a picture, a relatively recent picture of our team. As you can see, it takes quite a few people to get a lot of this work done. We are grateful to our patients who, again, have been tremendous partners along the way on this journey. Of course, we're still halfway there, but we continue to work very hard. And of course, I personally am indebted to this team of talented young scientists and physicians who work tirelessly to find treatments for kidney diseases. And so with that, I'd just like to thank all of you for your attention today, and I will be available if you have questions. I think there's a mechanism for that in the chat. And again, beyond this webinar, at any time, any one of you could feel free to reach out, and I would be delighted to connect and answer any questions you may have, or just simply get to know you better. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Greka. You're doing some really exciting work, and we would love to be able to share this information on our website. So I'll touch base with you after this to ensure that we can get that up on our website for patients to see.
Wonderful. Thank you.
I'd now like to introduce Dr. Janice Lea. Dr. Lea is a professor of medicine at Emory University and is board certified in nephrology and hypertension. She earned her medical degree at the University of Texas Medical Branch at Galveston and completed her residency in internal medicine and a nephrology fellowship at Emory University affiliated hospitals. She also received a Master's of Science degree in clinical research from Emory School of Public Health. Dr. Lea is currently a professor of medicine at Emory University, where she has practiced for over 20 years, and she is the clinical director of nephrology and the chief medical director of Emory Dialysis, which serves over 800 patients, including 150 of those on home dialysis. Dr. Lea's research and clinical expertise are in hypertension, chronic kidney disease, kidney health disparities, and dialysis. She's a nationally renowned expert in hypertension, designated a clinical specialist in hypertension by the American Society of Hypertension. Dr. Lea also is designated a master clinician by Emory School of Medicine and serves as the director of telenephrology at Emory since 2017. Dr. Lea also serves on the board of directors for the American Association of Kidney Patients, and she has been named one of Atlanta's top doctors for the past 10 years. Dr. Lea, we're so happy to have you join us today.
Thanks, Erin, for having me, and I'm happy to speak a few minutes about the importance of patient-centered research and some activities that I and AAKP are involved in the kidney space. My objectives for this session are to review priorities of dialysis patients and patients with chronic kidney disease, outline and discuss a patient-centered outcomes research project targeted for kidney patients, the PCORI grant that we have with AAKP and Emory University and Kaiser Permanente of Georgia. And then lastly, discuss the need for research in minority population who are most vulnerable to COVID-19 complications. Next slide. So this is just a list of priorities from various surveys that basically say what are priorities and perspectives of our dialysis patients. And for example, quality of life. They want to have a social life, they want to be able to work, stay employed, they want to participate in family milestones, see their kids in their activities, etc., grandkids. Of course, they want to feel better, and we know that patients who progress to dialysis, especially if they're on in-center dialysis, aren't able to do a lot of things that they used to do. And the ultimate goal is to be able to get a kidney transplant. And then, of course, length of life. Of course, everyone wants to live as long as they can. Next slide. So we have been strong advocates for patients choosing their own type of dialysis modality and encouraging use of home dialysis. And so these are important factors. I have a couple of slides that speak to what the patients want as far as what type of liberties they'd like to have with either dialysis or having a transplant. Some of the major things that that are consistent throughout the literature are in the level of independence. They want to be flexible, they want to be able to travel, etc. And again, quality of life, which I just highlighted on the previous slide. Next slide. And this is a pretty recent study just published last year. These are a summary of patients that are on peritoneal dialysis, and they were surveyed along with their caregivers. And this was in 3 countries, including the US. And over to the right, you'll see the major themes that came up as to what was important to the patient and to the caregiver. And that was reduced risk of infection. They want to be able to live longer, not have a high risk of death. They want to not feel so tired and fatigued. And then they want a flexible time schedule. Now, I highlight this slide because these are specifically issues that are of concern to patients. Certainly, they are of concern to physicians as well. However, as you all know, when you go to your nephrologist, to your dialysis unit, there's a set of metrics or measurements, labs, and things that are routinely discussed on a monthly basis, such as what your phosphorus is, what your KT over V, or how well your blood is dialyzed, etc. But none of these issues are actually listed. And so it's just to highlight why it's important to get the patient perspective onto what is important for your treatment and what your goals are, as well as some of the other things that the medical personnel focus on, which is, lab numbers, etc. Next slide. So how do we get more patient engagement in their care and also to hear their voices in research opportunities? Because we know, and you've already heard, that research guides clinical practice. So if the patients aren't involved in that process, their voices are often not reflected in what those particular studies and how they are designed. So we need more patient-centered research that addresses patient concerns and includes patients in the design of the study. And we'll talk specifically about the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, known as PCORI, that we have an active study with. Secondly, to develop more patient advocates and ambassadors to mentor other patients with similar experiences. And that's really the crux of our PCORI proposal, which I'll outline on the coming slides, that oftentimes for patients to really be engaged and be motivated to participate in their own care, as well as be involved in any type of research studies, it often helps and to have another patient actually engage with them to give them their experiences, as opposed to a medical person, a physician, etc., just telling them about the study or about their disease, but actually having a patient there who's been through it to give you their perspective and maybe on your own level, and you can understand and become more engaged in the process. And then patient focus and support groups are very important. Again, getting the perspective of the patient and getting that communicated to the group that is conducting the research. Next slide. So our PCORI grant, in conjunction I am with Emory University, I'm also with AAKP, and we also have Kaiser Permanente of Georgia. So we have really 3 entities all engaged in promoting kidney outcomes in chronic kidney disease patients. So the title of our project is Enhancing Patient Engagement through peer mentoring and improving outcomes in chronic kidney disease patients. And what our project is focused on first is coping strategies and how patients cope with having the illness of kidney disease. We know that a lot of our patients can be depressed, their livelihood is affected because they no longer can work, etc. And so those are the types of things that we are emphasizing in this particular project. Secondly is to increase the education and utilization of home dialysis and transplant. And I'll show you some data on that shortly. We have a steering committee and focus groups led by patients to direct the study design. And we were just awarded this grant last year. We sort of launched it from our local site here in Atlanta on World Kidney Day, right when, I think it was a week before the COVID pandemic really hit us here. So we had just really started trying to engage patients in this activity. It's focused on mentorship by AAKP ambassadors, and I'm sure some of the ambassadors are on this call, and you can get more information about the ambassador program for AAKP, but basically we're building upon that infrastructure to expand the role of the existing AAKP ambassadors and recruit new ambassadors to provide these educational materials to recruited patients and to provide the coping strategies information as well, so that it's all patient-led. We, the physician study team, are just sort of coordinating the efforts and connecting the ambassadors to the mentees and giving them the training materials that they use, but they are the ones conducting the sessions with the patients themselves. Next slide. So some of this project was based or sort of fueled from a previous PCORI project that was called Empowering Patients with on Choices for Renal Replacement Therapies. And some of the major questions that were addressed in that study were how do you cope with your kidney problems, and what bothers you the most about having kidney disease. Next slide. And so these are some of the answers from those surveys from that project. Patients expressed that the things that bothered them the most was the time spent on dialysis, the dietary restrictions, the inability to travel, the lifelong incurable and fatal aspects of their disease, the lack of control and lack of independence, and then limited treatment options. These were all of the major issues that were highlighted. Next slide. And so this particular paper really focused on different types of strategies that patients use to cope. And I'm not going to go over those in detail, but just to give you a framework for the kinds of things that we're doing in engaging patients in, is deciding if the patient has a coping strategy that indicates that they are engaged in their illness, meaning that they figured out how to problem solve, to restructure things based on their disease. Social support. Do they have family members that understand their illness and able to express emotions to? Those were all considered sort of positive engagement strategies. And then those that indicated or expressed that they were, that were discovered to be disengaged from the questions that were asked, were those who avoided the problem, had wishful thinking, i.e., I'm not really that sick, I'm not going to have to go on dialysis, and sort of socially withdrawn from their illness. And the whole point of this, determining whether the patient was engaged or disengaged, would help their mentors or their medical personnel, etc., to help deal with that patient, to help them really accept their disease. If you don't know if the patient is having positive problem solving and able to really accept their disease and try to be engaged, or if they're really avoiding the problem and disengaged, then they're not likely to follow treatment plans, etc. And thus these strategies are things that we will be focused on with the ambassadors and their mentorship to other dialysis and chronic kidney disease patients to help them best cope with their illness. Next slide. So solutions to improved patient engagement is referral to other patients with similar experiences, therapists if needed, and proper education. I think this is really important, education at the proper time and the proper mindset. For example, for a patient who is about to start dialysis, it's better to engage them, for example, with home dialysis education prior to starting in-center, because patients will get comfortable in-center and may not want to change to a home therapy. So these are all ways that we can improve, especially modality choices, and patients can be better aligned with the best therapy for them if education is done at the proper time. More time and effort focused on meeting patients and their needs, trust, and better communication. We think that's really, really important to really get the best results with the patient care and their subsequent outcomes. And oftentimes the patients may be able to relate to another patient better than their nurse or their physician, etc. Next slide. This is a study that I wanted to show regarding patients who were surveyed regarding what type of renal replacement therapy or particularly dialysis that they would want. For the patients who chose PD, peritoneal dialysis, they said that 95% of those patients, it was their choice. And they quoted that they had heard bad things about dialysis, hemodialysis, they had better quality of life, etc. For the patients who were on hemodialysis, only 47% of the patients, these are people on in-center dialysis, only 47% said they had a choice. So that means the other 53 were basically told to start hemodialysis, and they weren't given the options of peritoneal dialysis. Now, some of those did say that they were on hemo, that they feared doing home dialysis, particularly getting infections with TB, and they'd rather be treated by trained personnel than to do it at home. But again, only 47% were actually given that choice initially. Next slide. And then I showed this to contrast. This is a survey for physicians and nurses. And so they asked, what type of dialysis would you choose if you had to start dialysis? And not surprisingly, the majority, overwhelming majority, nurses and physicians said they would choose a home modality. And so the point here is why aren't our patients being steered towards home dialysis when the medical personnel would prefer that for themselves? Next slide. This is a study that I did a few years ago that looked at a national Medicare data set and just looked at the percentage of patients according to race who were either on home dialysis, either with hemodialysis or with peritoneal dialysis. And if you look at the first column, the percent on peritoneal dialysis, you see the whites 11.4%, Asians 10.7%, Hispanic 8.3%, and African Americans were the lowest at 6.6%. If you go over to home hemodialysis, all of the numbers are pretty low, which is, that's just the case. Only about 2% on average of patients in the U.S. are on home hemodialysis. But you can see that there's, disparities in the utilization of peritoneal dialysis. I believe currently the average number of patients or percent of patients on some home therapies is about 12% across the U.S. And just to highlight our particular program at Emory, I think Aaron mentioned in the introduction that we have a large population of home dialysis. It's actually closer to 20% of our population is actually on home therapy. So we are big proponents of home dialysis. Next slide. This, in contrast, is very encouraging news. This is a recent paper that looked at the USRDS data set, and they actually compared the changes in utilization of home dialysis. The first column is from 2005 to 2007. The second column is more recent, 2011 to 2013. And you can see that all racial groups have increased the utilization of home dialysis. The whites went from 8 to 10%, blacks from 5.2 to 8.3. So that was very encouraging. The Hispanics also went up, and as well as the Asians. Actually, they increased the most. So there is some encouraging news that there is some improvement in utilization of home dialysis. This particular paper actually didn't show, if you see at the bottom where it says transplantation rates, it actually was lower in the later years, even lower for blacks and lower for Hispanics. So that has not particularly improved. Next slide. Now, this is something that is taken from one of the papers I referred to earlier about the dialysis choices study that a big part of our PCORI project is based on. And this is like a web-based tool that patients can be introduced to allow them to make the decision about whether home dialysis is best for them or if they should be in-center. And I could bet that many of the patients on the phone did not have such a tool to help them decide. And this is something that we want to focus on and make improvements on in our particular project, encouraging home dialysis. But you can see the questions on the left, such as, I want someone else to be in charge of my dialysis. So you put either it doesn't matter at all or it does matter. So your level of interest in all of these questions will then move the bars to the right to whether or not you should choose in-center HD, and this particular one was for peritoneal dialysis. It wasn't for home hemodialysis. But there's questions like, you don't have to do dialysis every day, you want to travel, you want a flexible schedule, you rather provide your own care at home, those types of things. And if the patient really thinks about those things, they can make a more informed decision about what type of dialysis is actually best suited for them, instead of just letting the medical personnel tell them what type of dialysis they should do. Next slide. And that's just a reference for that particular tool. If you go on the website, choosingdialysis.org, you can actually click on that tool and play with it and answer the questions and see what you come up with as whether or not you're better suited for in-center versus home with PD. Next slide. Now, lastly, I just have 2 more slides. Richard already really gave an excellent introduction about the disproportionate effects of COVID-19, especially in the African American, and now becoming even more so in Hispanic. And we know that home dialysis patients, because they dialyze at home, are less likely to be exposed to the virus, as particularly in-center patients who have to travel out and be exposed to others 3 days a week. We also know that lack of access to health care with more comorbidities such as obesity, diabetes, hypertension, poverty, inability to social distance, more frontline workers, as Richard mentioned, all of these things contribute to this disparity. And we want to just, from this webinar, want to just highlight that we need more research in these high-risk groups so that we can identify and attenuate barriers to adhere to the mitigation strategies that have been implemented. Next slide. Richard's already mentioned some of the different funding mechanisms, including the NIH and PCORI. There's multiple private foundations that are putting out calls for research proposals. Most local academic medical centers are really pushing to get research to identify why we have these COVID disparities. And the topics of this research are a wide array, ranging from socioeconomic factors, how do we get more community engagement to help get the messages out around mitigation strategies and identifying patients at high risk. There's research around different ways to reach patients, including technologies such as telehealth. There's also some genetic components. I'm actually looking at some genetic determinants of COVID in African Americans that may predispose them to kidney injury. We also have found that these patients that aren't already a kidney patient or don't have CKD are developing acute kidney injury, and that's also disproportionately affecting African Americans. So are there any other factors other than socioeconomic, such as genetics, that may be contributing to this predisposition? Also, we're starting to hear more about long-term effects of COVID. I just saw something on the news about brain health, and we know mental health significantly is likely to be a major issue from this, from long-term consequences, not only with the patients, but their families, and especially those who lost loved ones so rapidly without time to really spend time with their family. These patients were, isolated from their families, and just the mental toll that that's had on some of these families, I think are all important long-term effects of this pandemic, and need to be evaluated and followed over time. And the next slide. So in summary, we just want to highlight again that minority populations are at heightened risk for poor health outcomes, including effects from COVID. Strategies to improve health outcomes in vulnerable populations can only be effective if minorities are well represented in the clinical research activities. And I believe that is my last slide. I think, I have here patients engaged in their own care have better outcomes, and I have my email address there for anyone who wants to contact me regarding any clinical trial participation, the PCORI project. I did mention we have added an extension on our PCORI project about coping. We're adding a piece on COVID-specific factors, surveys with the patients, etc. So this is something that we're doing primarily in Atlanta, but the ambassadors can come from anywhere as long as you can connect with the patient. But it's something that we hope will be a model for other areas across the country. And if there's anyone who wants to be involved in some way, even if you're not local, please let me know. And thank you very much. Look forward to any questions or discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lee. And I will get back to our question slide here. Right. We'll go ahead and take a few questions. If you have a question, please submit it via the chat feature, which is located at the bottom right of your screen. And we did have a couple of questions come in during the presentation, so I'll start with those. This first question is for Dr. Greka. They said they are familiar with the work of Broad in genetic diseases and watched Mr. Richard Nelson talk at the 2019 AAKP Global Summit about his family journey and your work. Can you tell them how they can work with AAKP and Broad to get more involved in these efforts in rare diseases?
Well, thank you. This is an excellent question, and it's true. Richard Nelson and his family have been incredible partners, and I'm so delighted to hear that you heard him speak, because I think it is both a heartbreaking, but also, I think, a hopeful story that he shares as his family has grappled with this disease for many generations. So just like Richard, I welcome anyone to reach out to us. I think, there's no other kind of way. Of course, I defer to AAKP about other ways in which patients can get involved, and I welcome anyone reaching out to us to get involved in our work in any way to raise awareness. Richard and his family have started a foundation that is focused on these diseases in an effort to raise awareness, and so actually Richard would be a tremendous person to reach out to and see if they could use more help and more patients getting involved. In terms of seeing what we do, before the coronavirus, our labs were open to patients who wanted to come and visit, and I always welcome patients coming to the Broad and seeing where it all happens. Actually, my team members, the scientists and doctors in my group, really appreciate meeting patients and hearing their stories, because that is a great motivator and a great inspiration for us in the lab. And especially for people who are not exposed to patients in the hospital, if they're scientists in the lab, it's really wonderful to have that opportunity to connect. So certainly if you're interested in genetic testing, you can reach out to us and we can enroll you. If you are interested in learning just about what we do, or to visit us when this pandemic is behind us and travel is safe again, of course, you're welcome to do that. If you have questions, I welcome you to reach out to me. My email, if you Google me, is on the Broad and the Brigham website, so it should be easy to find. And of course, the AAKP can provide that as well. And then I'll just defer to AAKP leadership about other ways that AAKP can be involved. I welcome any way that patients could be involved in our work at all times.
Thank you so much, Dr. Greka. Our next question here is for Dr. Lee. This question is, I want to become involved in a clinical trial as a CKD patient, but my family doesn't trust government or pharma companies much at all. Can you tell me if you think accountability and transparency has improved in the time that you have been working in clinical trials, and do you think patients have more protections now?
That is an excellent question, and an important one, because we are aware of the distrust of the mistrust of the healthcare system, especially in minority populations, dated years ago with different research projects, namely the syphilis project and the Tuskegee, etc. So yes, the things, have people, everyone is aware of those issues, and have, there's so much more regulation around those things to protect patients. It's really very, I would say, there's a term called HIPAA, which is related to patient privacy. There's when we have to do research studies, we have to get them approved. They go through a rigorous evaluation and scrutiny from what we call the internal review board, or the IRB is a term, and all research studies are subject to their interpretation of the study and whether it has the best interest of the patient involved. So yes, I think there's a lot more transparency and scrutiny behind research to where, and they've discovered that, the primary focus is the patient and their safety, as opposed to the actual research question being asked. I've seen some studies denied. They were good research questions, but the way in which they were being done was not the best or the most safe for the patient. Now, our PCORI project is Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, and it's actually not a federal funding agency, although it came out of Obamacare, but it was private funding that supported this research, and that was part of the issue. Is we need some type of funding mechanism that is focused on the patient first and not just on the science. So yes, there are major strides have been made in that area. And in our particular proposal, I would love for you to be involved. We're doing it in CKD patients as well as dialysis patients. You could potentially be a mentor to another CKD patient, and you really drive the session. I mean, no one is standing over you discussing or telling you what to say to the patient. So I think it's very transparent and patient driven and focused.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. In follow-up to that, do you think patients can be involved safely in trials during COVID-19? And does it concern you that kidney patients have not yet been involved in COVID-19 trials?
Yeah, other excellent questions. And I mean, that's the first part of that question. It depends on what the study is. So yes, research in general has been significantly impacted by COVID because of limited exposure, et cetera, social distancing efforts. So a lot of our research projects that weren't related to COVID have been on hold. Particularly COVID-related projects. I mean, it depends. Everything is mandated that whatever research is being done, as well as clinical care, has to follow the guidelines as far as social distancing. If you were to enter a medical facility, for example, you have to be screened to get your temperature taken, ask questions about your exposures, etc. Now, for the second part of that, as far as kidney patients, there are things coming down the pipeline, and we are being, our dialysis centers are being recruited for some CDC type studies looking at the whole antibody responses to the COVID, how long the antibody provides immunity. Certainly, I know whenever vaccines come around, we will be one of the ones that will be pursuing that. And we're doing testing in our clinics, are going to be starting doing testing, and those patients will be followed over time for conversion to antibodies, et cetera. So there are areas in which kidney patients are now being engaged and involved in these projects. Some other things are being done in the hospital, obviously with the active COVID patients. And so what really is important is because if the patients are very sick and incapacitated, their family members are being approached about participation in certain research, like the genetics and things like that. So really there are things that are going on, and that's why we're trying to spread the word for people to be open to participate in these things that are really trying to address, these disparities.
Thank you. Is there an opportunity for utilizing like a virtual platform such as Zoom or something in regards to these research activities?
Of course, and with our PROCORI grant with AAKP and Emory and KP Georgia, that is where we are now. That's where we're converting our patient, mentor, and mentee communication to be virtual. So that's why I'm saying even if someone on this call is not local, you could still participate, because right now everything is going to be virtual, and we will probably be doing that for a while to make sure that everybody is safe.
Thank you, and I'll ask Dr. Greka if she can respond to that as well. Are there opportunities for patients to be involved in your project virtually?
We welcome that, of course. We actually we had initially planned in partnership with the patient-directed foundation that Richard Nelson has spearheaded and his family. We had planned to do an in-person symposium that brings together doctors from all over the world and also patients from all over the United States. It was going to be in person this fall. Of course, that's not possible, so we're going virtual. And we will have designated time to spend time with patients to answer questions, but also patients are invited to attend as witnesses of the entire symposium to ask questions of the scientific work that is being presented, as well as the clinical work that would be presented. We want patients involved at every step. And so if you're interested in joining this symposium, certainly there are opportunities for that, and you just have to reach out to me, and I will connect you with the people on my team who are working on organizing this, and you would receive the Zoom link and participate. It will be sometime in late September, and anyone who's on this call or anyone else who you can think of to invite any patient, we would be delighted to have you.
Well, fantastic, and people listening to this can email AAKP at info@aakp.org, and we can share that their message with Dr. Greka as well. We have a couple of final questions, and I believe these are both for Dr. Greka. One person is asking about the rare diseases that you spoke about. Is it necessary to have seen it in one or both parents, or can it skip a generation and come from a maternal grandmother? And is it worth testing if that is someone's situation, that it came from their maternal grandmother?
I would say that it's still worth testing. Some of these diseases, it appears that they skip a generation. They may not, but it may be that the disease was milder in the intervening generation, or there are other factors that, we don't need to get into the details right now, but if there's a question, it is always worth testing in my mind. This scenario that is being described also makes me think of polycystic kidney disease, which we did not discuss today, but it's a much more common disease that affects the kidneys, of course. And that is quite well known to skip generations, not because the gene is not passed on, but because the disease doesn't manifest as severely for reasons that are not entirely clear. And there's a lot of active research going on that as well. So just to make it simple and short, I would say, certainly if there's a concern or a suspicion that something is running in the family, it is always a good idea to check, because then you could be paired up with the right clinical trials that may be starting up and eligible for treatments down the road. So I would argue it's always worth looking, for sure.
Great, thank you. And one final question for you. Can you talk about the balance that has to be maintained between patient expectations of deriving a benefit from a trial and transparency and ethical concerns relating to that?
Oh, well, of course, that is foundational, and I'm sure any one of my colleagues can speak to that as well. It's the foundation of every trial. Of course, I just want to emphasize that any treatment that comes to patients with kidney disease will have first been tested extensively for toxicity. And so our first concern, and all the regulatory agencies, including the FDA, anyone's first concern is harm. We do not want to cause harm. And so toxicity is something that is very, very important. Before we even start to think about whether a treatment works, the very first concern is for it not to harm any of the study participants. And so by the time you sign up for a clinical trial for a kidney disease drug, the toxicity has been addressed first in various other animals, and then ultimately also in patients as well, sometimes in volunteers who are not patients, who are healthy volunteers. Very cautiously, starting with very low doses and then slowly creeping up to the dose that you might want to give. So everyone who designs trials tries to be extremely careful about this, and there's never an intent of harm, of course. Now, is there a risk? Of course, one has to balance that there's always a risk when you're doing, participating in a study with a new treatment, that there will be an unanticipated risk. But again, all the physicians that I have ever worked with in clinical trials, all the investigators are very focused on making sure that the patients are well taken care of. And actually, there could be an argument made that patients who receive care because they're enrolled in a trial get more attention, you could say. Everybody redoubles their efforts to pay very close attention to those patients in the trial. And so they might be getting even more attention than, you know, a general patient showing up in a kidney doctor's office. So there are some advantages as well. Very careful care, access to the physicians at all times of day and night in case something goes on. And so there are advantages as well. Of course, there's always the balance of a risk of something going wrong. But again, that's something that we pay a lot of attention to try to avoid. And we monitor patients very carefully. So I would say that the way the trials are designed in modern times and with all the regulatory considerations that Dr. Lee spoke of as well, it is really a great benefit to the individual patient and also to the patient as a representative of the kidney community to participate in studies, not only because they stand to benefit as a person, as an individual, but also because the knowledge that they help generate can help other patients as well. And several of my own patients have participated in clinical trials. I encourage them to do so. We have never had a bad outcome, and they have been very well cared for, not by me, but by the physicians who were caring for them in these clinical trials. And everybody has had a positive experience. In some cases, they were also personally helped, and in other cases, they were not. But they always felt good about helping, their fellow woman and man who may be suffering from the same disease. And so, overall, I would argue that the benefits outweigh the risks. But of course, the purpose of informed consent is that a patient has the opportunity and the right to ask any and all questions and try to get to the bottom of what's happening with the given trial.
Great, thank you so much. Well, thank you to our speakers today. And if you had a question that we did not get to during today's webinar, please email us at info@aakp.org and we'll work with today's speakers to provide a response. We hope you have found this webinar informational. I would like to share a few slides in closing about some AAKP resources and services that may be of interest to you. If you are not already a member of AAKP, we hope you will join. We offer free membership to patients and their family members, as well as living kidney donors, and you can join online or by calling us. Be sure to include your email address, and you'll be notified by email when opportunities arise, like our flash surveys, where your opinions and experiences are needed to help inform innovation, advance care, and make a meaningful impact to improve lives. You can also select to receive any of our 5 electronic newsletters and subscribe to our printed bi-monthly magazine, AAKP Renal Life. We also invite you to follow us on social media for all the latest news and announcements. AAKP is dedicated to helping patients understand their condition and take control of their health care. We are proud to offer a variety of resources for both patients, family members, and caregivers. By visiting our website and clicking on the AAKP store button at the top of the homepage, you can find a variety of educational brochures and online tools to order online, by phone, or to download. I'd like to turn your attention to our webpage on clinical trials and research. This is where we have listed current research opportunities, and we also have a brochure that you can download that outlines what it means to participate in a clinical trial. Recently, AAKP President Richard Knight shared his thoughts on Juneteenth, and I believe he shared an excerpt from that statement on his intro slides earlier in the presentation. I encourage our listeners to visit our website and read Richard's full statement. AAKP holds a number of events throughout the year, and these events are live streamed and recorded. Trying to get back here, my apologies. Please visit our YouTube channel to watch presentations from our Global Innovation Summit, hosted in partnership with George Washington University, our annual Policy Summit, and our annual National Patient Meeting, all held last year. And we are gearing up for those same events to be held virtually this year. You can find all that information online, and all of our events are free registration. For more patient resources on COVID-19, please visit our coronavirus resource page on the AAKP website. You can access it from this link or from the red coronavirus information button on our homepage, aakp.org. The recording of this webinar will be shared on this page, and you can also find links to our other webinars here. We'd again like to thank today's speakers for sharing with us important information on the participation of kidney patients in clinical trials during and beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you again so much for joining us today. Be informed and stay safe.